Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Politics in the Pub. My name is Howard Bell. I'll be chairing this evening. I take this opportunity of paying my respects and acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and I refer in particular to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The topic this evening is homelessness. We're very blessed to have Alison from Shelton, New South Wales, and in addition we have Digby Hughes from Homelessness New South Wales. I'll introduce both of them and then I'll invite them both to speak for about 20 minutes. Digby Hughes is the Senior Policy and Research Officer at Homelessness New South Wales, which, as most of you know, is a peak not-for-profit organisation that works with its members to prevent and reduce homelessness across New South Wales. Its members include small, locally based community organisations, multi-service agencies with a regional reach, and large statewide service providers. Digby has worked in the community services sector for close to 20 years in a range of roles, including service provision, advocacy and policy. Alison is a policy officer at Shelton, New South Wales, the state's peak advocate for housing justice, and Shelton, New South Wales unites the voices of low-income tenants and non-profit organisations working on their behalf. So please join me in welcoming Alison and Digby.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I too would like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Shelton, New South Wales is a policy advocacy body that believes in a fair and just housing system for low-income people. Our focus is very much on the lower income people as well. Having said that, the housing system encompasses many things, and I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the housing system and why it's important. This will all make sense in terms of today's topic when Digby talks about homelessness as well, because the reality is without a fair housing system, the issue of homelessness will never fairly be addressed. I want to talk a little bit about the roles of government, because very often in our work, so many people assume that the role, housing is something about the state government. They forget about the Commonwealth government. And that leads us to the opportunities we have in the forthcoming election, because for the first time in many, many years, housing, and in particular affordable housing, has become a real issue. We've actually circulated, and both Digby's organisation and my own are part of a national campaign called Vote Home, and I'll be talking tonight about the asks in this particular campaign. In terms of the housing system in Australia, it's quite often described as being about a third of people own their homes outright, about a third of people are buying their homes with a mortgage, and about a third of the people rent. The bulk of that is in the private rental market. About 5% rent in what's called social housing, so public housing, and increasingly housing provided by community housing providers. That makes up about 5%. Those figures are still about the same, they're fairly stable, but there's been some substantial changes happening, particularly in the area of rent over the last few years. In many ways, our public debate is about how people view renting. Renting is something you do when you leave your parents' home before you get established, while you have your degree, do your degrees, get yourself established in work, get yourself established in life, and then you buy a house. And that's what most people think of as their aspirations. Curtin University recently surveyed a whole host of people in Generation Y, so people who are largely now in their 30s. they're still incredibly optimistic that home ownership is for them, despite the fact that increasingly they're being pushed out of the market. And lots of our stories in the media are about how young people can no longer assume that they are competitive in what's a fairly dramatic housing market if you're looking to buy. In terms of private rental, in 1981, of people who were renting in the private market, 40% were single people. They might be in couples, but they were largely single people. Now, in 2011, from the last census when we have the most reliable data, 41% are families with children. So not your typical image of what lots of people, and I would argue a lot of our policymakers and politicians, continue to think of as renters. So there's been some quite dramatic changes there. AHURI, the Australian Housing Urban Research Institute, have done a lot of work on this changing rental market. And what they talk about is that renting in the private rental market is no longer a transition that people make. It's actually becoming, it always was for a certain cohort of people, but it's actually becoming a substantial, important way for people to actually have homes. A third of all people in the private rental market have been renting for over 10 years, and 45% of those are in the lowest 40% of income distribution. The problem, of course, with the private rental market is it's very insecure. The average lease in New South Wales is, well, it's actually longer, but the standard lease is 6 months. And there is still, within the Residential Tenancies Act, a provision for no-cause eviction. So after your 6 months, you can be evicted without any particular reason on 90 days' notice. These are things that the Tenants' Union in particular, but I certainly know Shelter and Homelessness New South Wales, in the recent review of the Residential Tenancies Act, drew to government's attention as something that, given that renting has become more predominant and for different sorts of families, that these are things that really need to be addressed. So what we have is a housing system where people still think buying a house is a good thing to do. They still aspire to buy a house, but we know that increasingly renting in the private rental market is becoming something that they're doing for longer and longer. And so we have a slightly changing housing system at the moment. It's important for us to understand this because it does become an issue in terms of some of the reforms we think are important in terms of the federal election. It's important to understand too the roles of government in terms of housing policy. We're all aware that local councils approve construction, they set building regulations and they do urban planning. They do that, of course, within the framework of state government regulations and laws like the Planning Act, the state government provision of infrastructure, and of course the state government's major role in providing housing services. In the past, one of their biggest roles was in fact the provision of public housing, but increasingly they're looking to just administer these housing services, and community housing providers are being used far more to house people who would normally have been housed in public housing. And there's been over, I think, 10 years or so now, a move to transfer more public housing to community housing providers to manage and deliver those services. And of course the state government also provides funding to those organisations, and Digby will talk more about this, who provide services to people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. What most people forget is that the Commonwealth also has a rather major role to play in the housing system. They do this with their broad economic settings, they do this with their welfare policies, and they do this with funding to government and NGOs in the field. They also significantly do this with their tax settings, and I'll talk about negative gearing and capital gains tax in particular. All of these help set our system. The Commonwealth too also had a major role in funding housing programs, and from the end of the Second World War until the late 1970s, the Commonwealth actually were the major funder of public housing through grants given to the states. From the late 1970s to the early 80s, unfortunately, the Commonwealth's desire to continue that funding has eased off quite dramatically and has continued to decline. This has been a particular concern because what it does mean is that we continue to have a substantial waiting list for public and community housing, and state governments who are strapped for cash, although I understand the government in New South Wales now has a little more cash than they had expected, just don't seem to be putting it into housing. But the four state governments throughout Australia, they don't necessarily have the money available to both increase housing stock, but in New South Wales, a particular problem, they don't have the money to maintain what is an ageing housing stock and in some cases unsuitable for the people who actually need it. We find constantly there's a mismatch of stock between families and singles. There are far more people living by themselves than ever before, and that's the case in public housing as well. This is a feature of an ageing demographic, but also the fact that people are living longer, and for women in particular, living longer alone. So that's the changing face, not just in the community, but also for public housing tenants as well. Having said that, there continues to be a need for public housing for family groups and for different types of family groups. So while family sizes are generally getting smaller in Australia, there are some communities where that is not the case. Aboriginal families, for example, continue to be larger than non-Aboriginal families. And increasingly we also have the first generation migrants to Australia tend to have larger families. Second generation migrants the family sizes start to reduce. And that's been a feature of migration long before this current round as well. So there is those particular needs. It's why a number of organisations, non-government organisations who've been working in this field for decades, felt that on this election it was time we started to ask questions of candidates and political parties at a federal level and not just concentrate our efforts, as we have done for many years, at a state level. And we've come up with 5 key reforms that we think are important. The first one that I want to talk about today is that the Commonwealth commit to developing an affordable housing growth fund to reverse the trend that I spoke about. What we want to see is a fund established that has $15 billion over 15 years dedicated to affordable housing. Now, I think we should also talk about this term affordable housing. For organisations like Shelter, affordable housing means housing where households in the lowest 2 quintiles, so the bottom 40% of household incomes, pay 30% or less of their household income in housing costs. We're not talking about affordable housing for people who make a lot of money. Affordability is a little bit like that. What's affordable for one person may not be affordable for another. Where we see the priority is very much in that lower income space where people really are struggling. And we see that the government's investment, the federal government's investment, ought to be in that area as well. The current government has established an affordable housing working group whose work has been naturally suspended while the election is on. And this group has been looking at different mechanisms for how you might actually provide affordable housing using a mix of government investment, private investment and NGO contributions as well. The previous Labor government instituted a scheme called the National Rental Affordability Scheme, where essentially the Commonwealth was subsidising private and not-for-profit developers if they built housing that was rented at an affordable level for people. So sometimes called discount to market, but largely this was housing for whom people in the bottom 2 quintiles, so the lowest 40% of household incomes, could actually get a subsidised rent in effect. That model was relatively successful in other states, not so successful in New South Wales, I think largely because of the cost structures of property in New South Wales. But it certainly was successful enough for people to think that it was wrong when the current government ceased the program. We think initiatives like that had some way to go, but they won't happen without support from government, hence the need for the fund. The second reform is about a national homelessness strategy and plan, but I'm going to let Digby talk about that because that's clearly his area of expertise. The third reform, and this is something that the Vote Home partners have been saying for a long time, is that the Commonwealth needs to reform the tax treatment of rental housing. Negative gearing and capital gains tax allow for speculation on housing. The problem is that housing is actually a home to people. And the speculation means that the housing can be both unaffordable but also unpredictable and doesn't provide the stability that people need. We also think it puts increased pressure on the price of housing generally, whether it's for investment or for homeowners to actually purchase. We've long argued the case that negative gearing should not be allowed for housing generally, and so we've been pleased to see that the Greens have committed to removing negative gearing for housing altogether, and to for Labor to say that they will remove it other than for new properties from a particular point in time. However, the coalition, I've got to say, in what to us seems more a case of, well, Labor's doing it, therefore we must oppose it, have said that they won't make those changes. Prior to Labor's announcement, Scott Morrison, as Treasurer, had indicated that negative gearing was something the government needed to look at, and the Prime Minister, Mr Turnbull, had also indicated that negative gearing perhaps wasn't the best way to address affordable housing in the past. So we are disappointed to see that they've actually ruled that out. We continue to be optimistic, however, and to point out that so many commentators and experts in this field believe that if there's one thing the Commonwealth Government should do to address affordability of housing, whether it's to buy or for people to rent, is to remove negative gearing and to change capital gains tax. That would be it. We believe that needs to happen, and it needs to happen sooner rather than later. The fourth reform that we're looking at is to increase Commonwealth rent assistance. Commonwealth rent assistance is available to people to help pay rent, but it hasn't been changed for many, many years. And in fact, 40% of current recipients are still in housing stress even after receiving Commonwealth rent assistance. So that means they're spending more than 30% of their household incomes on rent or mortgage payments. Well, not mortgage payments, but even with Commonwealth rent assistance. The increase we're seeking at the moment is $22 per week. That's a maximum figure because Commonwealth rent assistance varies depending on whether you're single, you're a couple, and whether you have dependent children or not. So that's something we also think is absolutely essential if we are to make housing more affordable and fairer for people on lower household incomes. Our final reform is to address the shortfall of appropriate affordable housing for people with disabilities. This is something that has been a little bit of a sleeper. For lots of people, they believe that the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, housing actually, that isn't part of that particular scheme. And what we do know is that some of the interventions that people with disability will need and the support they will need will work much better if they actually have adequate housing for their needs. We're calling for 16,000 new units of specialist housing for people with disability, and we think that this should be managed largely through community housing providers. But for community housing providers to do this, they will need to build their capacity in terms of working with the particular needs of people with disability. We've also called in this reform to start to address the issue of universal housing design. Houses or units are very hard to retrofit for disability access, for example, or other features that are needed for people with disability. However, if you have universal housing design so that all new dwellings have these features, it's a much more cost-effective way to do it. Everyone thinks it's a great idea. Governments don't just seem to be able to get together to actually make it a reality. And that's something we think could certainly be led by the Commonwealth, the next Commonwealth government, in terms of the bringing together the states and territories and themselves to have this come to vision.